The night the man they called the wolf came down off the saraband. I was the one who heard the dogs before I heard the knock, and I'll tell you plain, I thought we were both about to die. I was old already that winter, old and broke and grateful, sleeping in the lean-to off Della Burnett's kitchen, because she'd taken me in 3 weeks before when no one else on the Quill River Road would so much as throw me a heel of bread. I'd come down out of the high country with a busted hip and $4 and a horse not worth the rope to lead it, and every door from Pell's crossing to the river had stayed shut to me. Hers hadn't. That was the whole of Della Burnett in one sentence, and if you understand that, you understand everything that came after. So when the wind came up that night like an animal trying to get under the eaves, and the dogs out in the dark set to that low singing that isn't quite a howl, I sat up on my cot, and I knew. There was only one man in that whole stretch of country who traveled with a pack at his heel, and the valley had spent 10 years teaching its children to be afraid of him. Della was already up. I heard her bare feet cross the plank floor, heard the iron bar of the door slide, and I came hobbling out fast as my hip would let me, hollering at her to wait, woman, for God's sake don't open it. She had it open before I cleared the kitchen. He fell across the threshold, like a sack of grain cut loose from a wagon. He was a big man made small by the cold, snow packed in his beard and frozen in the wolf-gray fur of his collar, his lips gone the color of slate. There was blood-crusted black at his temple where something had laid the scalp open, and his hands, when the firelight caught them, were claws he couldn't open. Behind him in the dark I could see eyes, low to the ground, green and gold and patient, 4 of them, 5, the big rangy dogs he ran with, and at least one that wasn't a dog at all, that stood off at the edge of the lamplight with its head down and its ruff up and would come no closer. Any sensible body would have screamed. Della knelt down in the snow that was already blowing in across her own floor, got her shoulder under his arm and said, "Asa, quit hollering and help me get him to the fire." That was how Eben Vance came into the Larkspur and into her life, and as it turned out into mine all over again, though I knew him and she didn't, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the country, because you can't weigh the kindness till you know how little she had to spare. The Larkspur sat where the Quill River Road bent away from the water and started its long climb toward the pass, a low log house and a sod-roofed barn and a corral of cottonwood poles, with a spring behind it that ran sweet and cold even in August. That spring was the whole reason there was a road ranch there at all. The stage stopped to water and the freighters stopped to water, and a body could buy a meal and a bunk and grain for his team. And that's how Tom Burnett had made his living, and how Della made hers after the fever took him 2 winters back. I never met Tom. By all accounts he was a decent enough man who worked himself into the ground and left her the place and a note at the bank in Pell's Crossing that she'd been paying down a little at a time, the way you'd empty a lake with a teacup. She did it alone, but for one old hired hand named Linus, who was near as stove-up as I was and about half as useful, and who I loved like a brother by the time that winter was through. Here is the thing you have to understand about the valley below the saraband. It was hard country full of hard people, and the hardest of them all was a man named Thaddeus Pryor, who ran the Crowfoot outfit and who had, over 20 years, swallowed up most everything a man could put a fence around. Pryor wanted the Larkspur, not the house. He had a house finer than the bank. He wanted Della's spring, because his summer range went dry and dusty by July, and a man who owned that spring owned the only sure water for 30 miles. He'd been after Tom for it before Tom died, and after Della twice as hard, on account of he figured a widow alone was a fence post you could just lean on till it fell. He didn't ride up with guns. Men like Pryor never do. They do their killing slow and with paper. First he bought up Della's note from the bank, quiet, so that of a sudden she owed her money not to a banker who'd known Tom but to the one man in the world who wanted her gone. Then he raised what he could on it and called the rest due come spring. Then, and this is the part that took the bread out of her mouth, he had a word with the stage company, and a word from Thaddeus Pryor was worth a great deal, and the stage stopped stopping at the Larkspur. Watered at his place instead, where he dug a tank just to spite her. The freighters followed the stage. Inside of a season, the road ranch that had fed half the travelers on the Quill River Road was feeding nobody but Della Linus, an old broke teamster named Asag Greer, and now a half-dead stranger and his pack of wolves. And still she fed every soul who came down that road. That was the wonder of it that I'd watched all season. A man would come limping along on the worst day of the year, run out of some camp or some marriage or some run of luck, and Della Burnett would set him a plate of whatever she had, which by January was beans and biscuit and not much beans, and she'd send him on with what she could spare, which was nearly always more than she could. I told her once she'd give away the roof if a man came by needing shingles. She just looked at me over the dough she was working and said, "And what do you suppose a roof is for, Asa, if not to be over somebody's head?" I didn't have an answer to that. I still don't. So now you can weigh it. The night the wolf fell across her dorsal, she had a banknote coming due that she had no earthly way to pay, a spring a powerful man meant to take, a larder near bare, 2 old men eating into it who couldn't pay her a dime, and a winter still to get through. And she knelt in the snow and got her shoulder under the most feared man in the country and brought him to her fire, and the only question she asked all that long night was whether he could swallow if she spooned broth between his lips. We got his boots off and his coat off and got him near the fire, but not too near, because Linus, who'd trapped in his young days, said a froze man warmed too quick will die of it, and I believed him. Della cut the frozen rags away from where the blood had glued his collar to his neck and cleaned the gash at his temple with hot water and a clean cloth, and never once flinched, though I'll tell you the man looked like something the mountain had chewed and spit back. She set a kettle going. She sent Linus out with a lantern, against my hollering, to coax the dogs into the barn out of the wind, and damned if those gray devils didn't follow that little old man into shelter like he was their own. All but the one that wasn't a dog. That one bedded down in the lee of the woodpile and watched the house all night with its yellow eyes, and would let no man near. Toward morning, the stranger's breathing steadied, and some color came back into his face, and Della sat by him in the rocker with the broth and her own shawl over his chest, and that was when I came around the fire to look close, and my heart turned right over in me. Because I knew that face, older and harder and beat half to death, but I knew it. I'd ridden 2 years beside that man when we were both young and the country was wilder than it is now, before the grief that hollowed him out, before he went up into the Saraband to live with horses and dogs and his own black thoughts, and let the valley make him into a haint to frighten its children. The wolf of the Saraband, they called him. I'd heard them say it in Pell's Crossing my own self, lowering their voices like saying it loud would call him down. The man who killed his own wife, they said, or let her die, or worse. I'd heard a dozen versions and not one of them was true, and I knew the true one, and it was sadder than all their lies put together. His name was Eben Vance, and the country had it half right. He was a wolf, in a manner of speaking. He'd just been alone so long he'd forgot he used to be a man. I didn't say a word that night. It wasn't mine to say. I sat down across the fire from Della, and I watched her keep a dying stranger alive with broth and a shawl and not one question, and I thought, old woman is going to find out what she's got in her house soon enough, and I purely could not guess how it would go. He woke on the 3rd day. I was in the barn when it happened, gentling the dogs, who'd taken to me on account of I smelled like the high country still, and I didn't fear them. I heard Della cry out, not in fright. In surprise, and I came as fast as I could, and found Eben Vance sitting up on the husk tick by the fire with one big bandaged hand wrapped clean around Della's wrist, holding it. Not hard, just holding, and the two of them staring at each other like a couple of strangers who'd met in a dream. "You're at the Larkspur," she was saying, slow and steady, the voice you'd use on a spooked horse. "On the Quill River Road. You came in out of the storm 4 nights back. You're safe here." He let her wrist go like it had burned him. His voice when it came was a rusted hinge, a man who hadn't used words in months. "Who brought me in?" "I did." He looked at her a long moment. "You shouldn't have." "Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you," Della said, and went back to the stove like the matter was settled. "But I did, and you're going to eat this whether you've a mind to or not." I'll never forget the look on him. Like a man who'd braced for a blow his whole life and got handed a bowl of soup instead and didn't have the first idea what to do about it. He didn't trust it. Of course he didn't. He'd had 10 years of the valley crossing the road to keep clear of him, of women pulling their young ones indoors, of men touching their guns when his shadow fell across a saloon door. A man learns from that. He learns that he is a thing to be feared and not a man to be fed, and he builds himself around that knowing until it's all the shape he's got. He ate her soup with his eyes on us the whole time, the way that Wolf out by the woodpile watched the house, waiting for the trap to spring. It never sprung. That was the thing he couldn't fathom, and I could see it working on him day by day. He'd wake expecting to be turned out and Della'd hand him coffee. He'd brace to be charged for the doctoring and the keep, and there was no bill, because there was no bill in Della Burnett's nature. He'd test her, say something hard, look at her dark from under those heavy brows, the way he'd surely scared off 100 men, and she'd just look back at him plain and unafraid and ask did he want more biscuit. The man did not know what to do with mercy. Hadn't been issued any in so long he'd lost the receipt. By the second week he was up and moving, slow and favoring his side where the cold had got into an old wound, and a man like that can't abide eating bread he hasn't earned. So he started to work. Lord, did he work. He found the corral poles half rotted and he cut new ones from the cottonwoods and set them deep. He found the barn roof letting weather and he stripped it and laid new sod with Linus passing him the spade. He found the spring box choked with leaves and ice, and he cleaned it out so the water ran clear and cold and full again. He never asked what wanted doing. He just walked the place at first light like he was reading it, and then he'd take up an axe or a spade or a maul, and that big stove-up frame would get to work, and by dusk something that had been falling down was standing up. He didn't talk. I want to be fair to the man. He was not an easy guest. He spoke maybe 20 words a day, and most of them were to the dogs. But he watched Della the way a man dying of thirst watches a creek he isn't sure he's allowed to drink from, and I watched him watch her, and I thought, well, here is a thing I didn't expect to live long enough to see. The wolf, the real one, the one that wasn't a dog, came in off the woodpile about then too. Not all the way. But it would take meat from Eben's hand now, and one cold morning I came out and found it lying across the barn door like a gray ghost, and Eben crouched beside it with his hand in its ruff, talking low, and the animal had its eyes half shut. I stopped where I was and didn't breathe. When he saw me, he stood up slow. "Found her in a deadfall trap 2 winters back," he said, which was about the most words he'd strung together since he woke. "Leg near off, wasn't going to leave her in it." He looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at him, and something passed between them that I won't pretend to understand. Couldn't no more leave her in it than. He didn't finish, but I knew how the sentence ended, than anybody could leave a half-frozen man on a doorstep. He'd been the thing in the trap, and Della'd been the one who couldn't walk past, and the man was just then beginning to feel the shape of that. Now, here is where I have to tell you the secret I'd been sitting on, the thing that makes the whole tale turn, and I want you to understand that I'd kept it not out of meanness, but because it wasn't mine to spend. The valley thought Eben Vance was a half-mad mustanger who lived in a cabin up the Saraband and trapped and broke wild horses and was likely a murderer besides. The valley was wrong about all of it, and most wrong about this. They thought he was poor. He wasn't poor, he owned the country. I'd known him before the grief, when we were both hands for an old cattleman named Garrow who'd come into that valley first of anybody and proved up every section of it that was worth proving, water and grass and timber, more land than a man could ride across in 3 days. Old Garrow had no kin. What he had was Eben Vance, who'd come to him a half-grown orphan and worked for him 20 years and was nearer a son than a hired hand. And when Garrow died, he left it all to Eben. All of it. The deeds were filed proper in the county seat, and they'd hold up before any judge in the territory. Then Eben's wife died in childbed, and the child with her, a hard, clean, awful piece of bad luck that no man could have stopped and that he blamed himself for anyhow, the way grieving men do, and Eben Vance walked away from all of it. Didn't sell it. Didn't work it. Just walked up into the high country with his horses and his dogs and let the lawyers keep the papers and let the valley fill up beneath him with men who thought the land was theirs to grab. Men like Thaddeus Pryor. Here's the joke of it, and it's a bitter one. Pryor had spent 20 years swallowing range, fencing water, running off little outfits, calling notes due, and near every acre of it, every section he was so proud of, he held on a lease or a graze right or a quitclaim that traced back, if you followed it far enough through the courthouse, to old Garrow's original pat, to Eben Vance. Pryor was a tenant who'd convinced himself he was a king. And the king was up the mountain talking to a three-legged wolf, and didn't care enough about any of it to come down and say so. Until a widow gave him her last loaf of bread. I figured all this out in pieces, lying in my lean-to nights, listening to Della and Eben not talk to each other by the fire, the silence between them getting warmer by the day. I figured it out, and I held my tongue, because a man's name is his own to give back, and Eben hadn't given his yet. He hadn't told Della who he was. I don't believe he'd told her anything in all those weeks except his given name and that the wolf was called Smoke. He let her think she'd taken in a poor mustanger, and she fed him the same as she'd have fed a poor mustanger, which is to say, like he was the only guest at a wedding, and that, I came to see, was the exact thing that was healing him. If she'd known he held the deed to her own ground and a half the valley besides, the kindness would have meant something different. As long as she gave it for nothing, it meant everything. He was drinking it down like a man who'd been a long time dry, and I think he was terrified of the morning she'd learn the truth and look at him different. She learned it, but not yet, and not how he feared. What came first was the trouble. It was the last week of February, the worst of the cold broke, and the country sodden and brown and mean, when Thaddeus Pryor rode up to the Larkspur with 3 of his men, and I will tell you that the air went tight as a drumhead. Eben was out back at the spring. Linus was in the barn. It was just Della and me on the porch when they came clopping into the yard, Pryor in a good coat on a good horse, looking at the place like a man pricing a hog. "Mrs. Burnett," he didn't get down. "I'll come to it. Your note's due the 1st of April, principal and all the interest I'm owed. You can't pay it, and we both know that, so I'm here to do you a kindness." He said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. "I'll take the place off your hands, clear the note, and give you stage fare to wherever you've got people. That's better than you'll get from the marshal when he puts you off it for nothing." I watched Della's jaw set. She was a small woman, and she had to look up at him on that big horse, and she did it without a quaver. "This is my home, Mr. Pryor. Tom and I built the half of it that wasn't already built, and I've kept it 2 years alone. I'm not selling you my spring." "You're not selling me anything. You're losing it to the bank, which is me. And I'm offering you fare out of charity." He smiled, and it was a banker's smile, the worst kind. "Don't be a fool, woman. There's no one coming to help you. There never was. You fed every saddle tramp on this road for 2 years, and not one of them's worth a bucket of spit when the ground freezes. You're alone." And that's when Eben came around the corner of the house. He came slow, wiping his hands on a rag, the 3 dogs falling in at his heels, and Smoke the gray wolf drifting out of the barn's shadow behind him, so that of a sudden there was a pack in that yard and a big scarred silent man at the head of it. Pryor's men reached for nothing. They weren't fools, but their horses sidled and rolled their eyes, the way stock will at a wolf, and the whole shape of the morning changed. Pryor looked at him. For a second I saw something cross the cattleman's face, not fear exactly, but a kind of itch, like a man who's seen a face before and can't place where. "You," he said. "You're the one lives up the Saraband, the mustanger," a sneer to cover the itch. "The wolf. So that's where you've crawled to. Well, this is no concern of yours. Get on back to your horses." Eben didn't say anything. He just walked to the porch and stood at the bottom of the steps between Della and the men on horseback, and looked up at Pryor with those flat gray eyes, and the silence stretched out so long that one of Pryor's men cleared his throat. "April the 1st, Pryor said to Della, but he kept one eye on Eben now. "Have your answer. Have your things packed." And he reined around and rode out, and his men went with him. And the minute they cleared the yard, the dogs set up that low singing again, telling the country what they thought of him. Della let out a breath I don't think she knew she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, not from fear. I came to know her well enough to know the difference, but from fury held down. She turned to go in, and Eben put out a hand, not touching her, just a little, the way you'd stop someone gentle. "How much?" he said. "The note." She told him. It was a number that would have bought a small town. She told him because there was no sense not to, and then she laughed, short and tired. "Why, you going to break me a wild horse worth that much by April?" She wasn't unkind. She was just a woman at the end of a long rope. He looked at her like he wanted to say a great deal and had only ever learned how to say a little. "Don't pack," is what he settled on. "Don't pack a thing." Then he turned and went to the barn and saddled his horse. The first time he'd touched a saddle since he came, and he whistled the dogs, and smoke ghosted up out of nowhere. And inside 10 minutes he was riding up the Quill River Road toward the pass and the high country, and I stood on the porch beside Della and watched him go, and my heart went down into my boots. Because she didn't know where he was going or why. And I did, and I couldn't be sure he was coming back. The man had walked away from that valley once when his heart broke. I'd watched him do it. I had no guarantee he wouldn't do it again, that the trouble and the noise and Pryor's sneering face and the whole weight of the world he'd put down on purpose wouldn't be more than a half-healed man could pick back up. Della watched the road a while after he was gone from sight. "He'll not come back," she said, quiet, and there was something in how she said it that told me more than she'd have liked. She'd let herself care, the careful woman, against all her own good sense, and now she figured she'd get the usual wage for it. "They never do." "Some do," I said. "It was all I had." She made supper for me and Linus, and there was a plate set for him out of plain habit, and she looked at it a long while before she put it away, and didn't say anything, and I didn't either. He was gone 11 days. I counted them. Della counted them too, though she'd have sworn she didn't. The country thawed and froze and thawed again. March came on raw. The 1st of April crept up like a thing under a door, and on the 30th of March a rider came down from Pell's Crossing with a paper for Della from the bank, from Pryor, saying the marshal would be along on the 2nd to put her off if the note weren't paid, and I watched the last of the hope go out of her, and I about gave it up myself. I thought, I have lived long enough to see one truly good soul in this world, and I am going to watch the country grind her up the way it grinds up everything that won't fence its neighbor out. Then on the night of the 31st, the dogs sang. Not the warning song, the other one. The glad one, the one they only made for him. And Della was up off her chair and to the door before I'd got my cane under me, and she threw the bar and opened it, and the yard was full of horses. Not Pryor's men. Riders I didn't know, a dozen of them, hard, quiet men with the high country on them, and a wagon, and at the head of them on a tall gray horse was Eben Vance. But not the Eben who'd ridden out. This man sat up straight, and he'd shaved the worst of the beard and put on a good coat that fit his shoulders, and there was something in how he held himself that I recognized from 20 years back, before the grief, when he was Garrow's right hand and the best man in the valley and knew it. The wolf had come down out of the saraband, but he hadn't come down as a haint to frighten children. He'd come down as the man who owned the ground they stood on. He got off the horse and he came up the steps to where Della stood in the lamplight with her hand at her throat, and he took off his hat, which I'd never once seen him do, and he said, "I'm sorry it took so long. The papers were in the county seat, and the seat's 4 days each way in this mud." "What papers?" Della said. And he told her, standing there on her own porch in the cold with his men waiting in the yard. Eben Vance told her, in more words than I'd heard him say in 2 months put together, who he was. About old Garrow and the patent and the deeds. About the high country and the years he'd let it lie, because a man with a broke heart hasn't got the use of anything. About how Thaddeus Pryor's whole Crowfoot empire, the range, the fenced water, the tank he'd built to starve her stage line, sat on graze rights and leases that traced back, every blessed one, to land that Eben Vance held in fee simple, free and clear, with the papers to prove it. About how he'd ridden to the county seat and put a lawyer to work, and how Pryor was, in plain fact and in law, a tenant who'd been squatting on borrowed ground for 20 years and never paid Eben Vance a dime, because Eben Vance had never asked. "And your note," he said. He reached into the coat and brought out a folded paper and held it out to her, and his hand wasn't quite steady. "I bought it back. From the bank, over Pryor's head. Turns out a man'll deal quick when you show him whose name's on the deed under his bank. It's yours, free. The Larkspur's yours clear, and the Spring's yours, and I had my man put it in writing so there's no taking it back." He pressed the paper into her hand and folded her fingers over it with his two big scarred ones. "Don't pack. I told you not to pack." Della Burnett stood there holding the deed to her own home and looked up at him, and I watched her face go through about 6 things at once. And then she did the thing that told me everything I needed to know about the both of them, and it wasn't to thank him. She got mad. "You let me think you were poor," she said. "All this winter. You ate at my table and chopped my wood, and you let me give you the last of what I had, and you owned the whole. You could have paid me 100 times over, and you let me—" She stopped. Her voice had gone thick. "Why would you do that? Why would you let me give like that when you didn't need it?" "Because I needed it," Eben said. And that stopped her cold. "Not the bread," he said. The rusted hinge of his voice had gone soft, and I had to lean in to hear it, and I'm not ashamed to say my old eyes stung. "Not the keep. I've got more money than I've got use for, and I haven't touched the most of it in 10 years. I needed—" He worked at it, the man who never talked, trying to find the size of the thing. "There wasn't a soul in this valley would put a plate in front of me without I was holding the deed over their head to make 'em. You didn't know I had a thing. You took me in like I was worth taking in, like I was just a man froze on your step and not—" His jaw worked. "Not the wolf. You're the only one in 10 years looked at me and saw a man. I wasn't going to spoil it by telling you what I was. I wanted one place in the world where somebody was kind to me for nothing." He looked down at her, this huge, feared, lonesome man, and he said the truest thing I ever heard him say. "You fed me when you thought I had nothing. I'd be the lowest dog in the territory if I rode off when I found out you had nothing either." I had to look away. A man my age doesn't like to be caught the way I was caught right then. Pryor came on the 2nd of April with the marshal like he'd promised. He rode into that yard puffed up and certain, and he found it full of Eben Vance's riders and Eben Vance's dogs, and he found Eben Vance sitting on Della Burnett's porch step with a wolf at his feet and a sheaf of deeds across his knee, and he found the marshal, who could read a courthouse seal, going pale and quiet at his side. It didn't take guns. I want that understood, because the valley likes to tell it like there was a great gunfight, and there wasn't. There was just Eben handing the marshal the papers, and the marshal reading them twice, and then the marshal taking off his hat to Della and apologizing for the trouble and turning his horse around. There was Pryor going from red to white as it came to him, slow and then all at once, that the empire he'd built was a house he'd raised on another man's floor, and that the other man had just come downstairs. Eben told him, level and almost kind, that he could keep his graze rights, that nobody was running the Crowfoot off. The valley was big enough, but that the rights ran through Eben now and not the bank, and that the first thing they were going to fix was the water. That the Larkspur's spring was the Larkspur's, and the stage would stop there again. And if Pryor wanted to keep watering his herds at that tank he'd dug, he'd do it neighborly or not at all. Pryor opened his mouth. He looked at the dogs. He looked at the deed. He shut it. And he rode out of that yard a smaller man than he rode in, and as far as I know he never crowded a widow again, which I doubt was conscience and more likely was arithmetic, but the result's the same either way. And then it was spring, and the stage came back, and the freighters with it, and the larkspur filled up again with travelers and dust, and the good noise of a road ranch making its living. Della hired 2 girls from Pell's Crossing to help with the cooking, on account of she could afford to now, and she still gave away more than she charged. And Eben never said a word about it because he'd finally figured out it was the best thing in her. He didn't go back up the saraband. He brought his horses down instead, the wild ones he'd broke, and built up the corral he'd already mended, and he and Linus and me, when my hip allowed, which wasn't often, but I like to think I helped, turned the larkspur into a horse outfit alongside the road ranch. The dogs slept on the porch. Smoke the wolf kept to the barn and the high pasture and would still come to no hand but Eben's, but she'd let Della pass close. And once I saw the wolf follow her across the yard at a little distance like a gray shadow that had decided, against its nature, to belong to somebody. He asked her in May. I know because I was there, which I oughtn't have been, but the porch is the porch and an old man's got to sit somewhere. He didn't kneel and he didn't make a speech. It wasn't in him. He just said, of an evening with the light going gold off the saraband, that he'd spent 10 years being a wolf and he was tired of it, and that if she'd have him he'd like to learn to be a man again, and that he'd understand if she didn't want to tie herself to the thing the valley feared. And Della Burnett, who'd faced down Thaddeus Pryor without a quaver, looked at him a long moment and then she said, Eben, I knew what you were the night I opened that door. A man too cold to stand and too proud to ask. I took you in then and I'll take you on now, and I'll not have you talking about yourself like you're something to be afraid of in my hearing again. And then her voice broke its proud edge and went soft. You found out I had nothing and you stayed. There's not another man in this valley would've. I'd be a fool to let you ride off twice. He didn't say anything to that. He just reached over and took her hand in his 2 scarred ones the way he'd folded the deed into them, and they sat like that, watching the light go off the mountain, and I got up quiet as my hip would let me and left them to it. They were married in June by a circuit preacher, in the yard, with the dogs lying in the shade and smoke watching from the barn door and the whole of Pell's Crossing come out. The same folks who taught their children to fear him, eating Della's wedding supper off long plank tables and looking sheepish about it, the way people do. Linus cried. I'll own that I did too. The wolf of the saraband stood up in a clean shirt and married the widow who'd fed him, and the valley that had spent 10 years afraid of him spent that whole afternoon trying to pretend it never had been. I stayed on at the Larkspur the rest of my days, which weren't so many, but they were the best I had. They gave me the lean-to off the kitchen for my own, and never once made me feel I was eating bread I hadn't earned, though God knows I'd earned little enough. I watched Eben Vance unlearn 10 years of being a haint. I watched him grow easy at his own table, watched the words come a little freer in him year by year, watched him take to standing in the doorway of an evening looking out at the country he'd let lie so long and finally not flinch from it. He kept his deeds and he was generous with them, and the valley below the saraband got to be a softer place to live, with the water shared out fair, and the most of the credit for that belonged to a small, stubborn woman who couldn't walk past a froze man on her doorstep. I think about that night a good deal, now that I'm near the end of my own road. The wind and the dogs singing and her bare feet on the cold floor and me hollering at her not to open the door, and her opening it anyhow. She didn't know she was opening it on the man who owned the ground under her feet. She didn't know there was a fortune froze half to death on her sill, nor a husband, nor the end of all her troubles. She didn't open it for any of that. She opened it because there was a soul out in the cold, and she had a fire, and a roof's no good to a body unless it's over somebody's head. That's the whole of it. The country called him the wolf and feared him and rode past him for 10 years, and a widow with nothing fed him for nothing, and the man she gave her last loaf to turned out to hold the deed to every acre from her door to the mountains. But I want it understood, by anyone who hears this told, that the bread came first and the fortune came after, and not the other way around. She wasn't kind because she knew. She was kind because she was Della. The rest was just the world, for once, paying back what it owed. He outlived her by 2 winters, After a long, good run of years I won't trouble you with except to say they were happy ones. When she went, he didn't go back up the mountain. He stayed at the Larkspur and kept her table laid for travelers, and gave away more than he charged, the way she'd taught him. And when his own time came, they buried him beside her on the rise behind the spring, with the dogs lying in the grass and the saraband going gold in the evening light. And I'll tell you, the gray wolf came down off the high pasture that day and lay at the foot of the grave a long while before it slipped off into the timber, and I never saw it after. A man froze on a doorstep, a woman who couldn't walk past. That's where all of it started, and I've never come across anything since that's worth more than a door open to the cold.